Had to build it up a little bit there. All right, so behind me, there are two pictures. One is of a terrorist, specifically a member of ISIS, and the other of a couch. Now I want to pose to you and to anyone who may be watching this a question. Which of the subjects of these two images is the more frightening? The terrorist. I think we can all agree that based on these two pictures alone, the terrorist is the more frightening. I'd be surprised if anyone answered the couch. But now I want to point something out, and this goes particularly to the Americans in the audience. I will admit that the speech I want to give today and the points that I want to make pertain almost exclusively to Americans, but I am an American. Firstly, I want to speak to the people of my country. Secondly, we Americans are notorious for not really caring about the rest of the world. We do though, I promise. Well, some of us do, but I digress. Back to the pictures and the point that I want to make. See, while the terrorist is more frightening, if you are an American, you are just as likely to be killed by unstable furniture as you are to be killed by a terrorist. I doubt that you'll be looking at couches the same way again. Or will you? Will you look at couches any differently with the knowledge that they are just as likely to kill you, perhaps even more likely to kill you than a terrorist? I would guess that you wouldn't. You won't fear couches. You won't have police monitor furniture stores. You won't call for a complete and total shutdown on any furniture at all entering the United States until we can figure out what the heck is going on with all these couches. Now, terrorism is a very real threat in the world we live in today. Terrorist organizations are responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. They commit heinous acts. They commit genocide. They send children to blow themselves up. They enslave and abuse women. They destabilize regions and spread fear across the globe. In 2010, 13,186 people were killed in terrorist attacks. And this was before the emergence, or perhaps better put, the resurgence of ISIS. And of those 13,186 people, 15 were Americans. 15. And of those 15 Americans killed in terrorist attacks in 2010, none were killed on American soil. Now, those 15 lives were precious and irreplaceable. 15 lives that meant the world to many other people. But I would argue that it is time for Americans to take a minute and seriously and soberly reflect on how much we are threatened by terrorism. As Americans, we value our personal liberties. We cherish our right to live our lives the way we want to. The mayor of New York wants to ban big sodas. Our president wants to make us get health insurance. We'll march, petition, we'll put on wigs and wave flags. One of the enduring symbols of the American Revolution is a snake, poised and ready to strike. And underneath that snake are the immortal words, "Don't tread on me." I like this image. It's been appropriated by a certain segment of the Republican Party that I may not agree with, and it's a bit violent and aggressive maybe, but I love the gumption. It says, we will live the way we want to. We will live freely. And we'll be damned if you try and tell us what to do or try and make us do something that we don't want to. But when it comes to terrorism, we forget this. We lose our gumption. We lose our courage. Nowadays, some of the loudest advocates for small government are more than willing to allow the government to monitor its own citizens and chip away at our civil liberties, as long as it's in the name of national security. We allow Americans who have not been charged with a crime to be killed in drone strikes. We say that the Boston bomber, an American citizen, should not have been given his Miranda rights because that way the FBI could have gotten more out of him. And we allow hateful rhetoric and unconstitutional ideas to be treated as legitimate security policy suggestions. And it might seem like common sense. There is a global threat. the global threat of terrorism, and many terrorists speak openly of their hatred for the United States, of their desire to attack the United States. Shouldn't we adjust our behavior? I argue that we should, but we should adjust it to reflect the reality of the threat, not our perceptions of it. Now, think about driving. When you get behind the wheel of a car to go to the supermarket or to work, you understand the risks. We know that driving is dangerous. We allow serious regulation of our driving practices. Speed limits, stop signs, traffic lights, the list goes on. In Illinois, before you get your license, you have to get a permit, drive for 50 hours in the car with an adult with a certain amount of time dedicated to highway driving and nighttime driving, pass a test, and even then, for the first year of your license, you can only drive with one other person in the car that isn't family. We allow common sense regulation of driving to make the practice safer, and still, so many people die in car accidents every year. Over 37,000 and millions injured, according to the Association for Safe International Road Travel. But now, take a moment to think. When you get behind the wheel of a car, are you gripped with fear? Are you terrified, just waiting for this drive to be over so you can get out of this 2-ton metal projectile that is surrounded by other human beings controlling their own 2-ton metal projectiles? Probably not. And why not? I talked with someone about this, about why we are so terrified of terrorism, but so casual mentally about driving, generally speaking, even when the latter is far deadlier. And this person says something to me that I find quite interesting. See, when you drive, you feel some control, and you feel some trust. You have confidence in your abilities to do what you can to avoid a risk, and you believe that others, for the most part, will do what they can too. But when it comes to terrorism, the average citizen has very little control. And with the media reporting on terror attacks from across the globe daily, with attacks in places like Paris and Brussels and Nice getting coverage for months, not to mention places like Beirut and Istanbul, and with our leaders constantly warning of the threat of terrorism and the brutality of terrorist organizations, it's no wonder we fear. Psychologists will support this. Terrorism is meant to target our emotions, and its unpredictability causes us to react emotionally. Terrorists, as the name would suggest, are very good at playing to people's fears. But the fact is, there are so many things that threaten us so much more at home, issues we truly need to tackle. Researchers at Columbia University found that between 1986 and 2006, nearly 1 in 5 deaths in America was related to obesity. Research for diseases such as Alzheimer's and diabetes receives far less than the trillions that have been invested in the war on terror, yet these diseases kill thousands of Americans annually. And then there is the violence in America itself. Between 2005 and 2015, 71 Americans were killed in all extremist attacks. In Chicago, in 2016 alone, more than 760 people were murdered, the most since 1997. Neighborhoods not too far from where I'm from are war zones for gang conflict, where little boys are executed in alleyways whose brutality and cowardice cannot be fathomed. Why is there no political census around issues like gang violence or obesity or disease? Why are we not so much more frightened of these issues that threaten us so much more at home? And why are our leaders not constantly mentioning these issues on debates on the floor of Congress? We should all be asking ourselves these questions. Now, the biggest challenge to changing America's perception of terrorism and the way it confronts terrorism is that it's not politically savvy to say that for all intents and purposes, the threat of terrorism harming Americans is misunderstood and perhaps even exaggerated. Now, democracy is a messy but beautiful thing. One of the occasionally messy aspects is in order to keep their jobs, politicians must win elections. I can't fault the politician for making a decision based on winning an election. They want to keep their jobs just like everybody else. And sometimes this means saying what's popular without saying what's necessarily right. But one of the beautiful things about democracy, and this may be optimistic, but in a democracy, we have the ability to shape what is politically expedient. As a nation, we are truly and deeply frightened of terrorism. And as a nation, we need to look deeply and objectively and rationally at the threat it poses to our daily lives. We have shaped our counterterrorism policy in reaction to one of the darkest days in American history. As the dust was still clearing at Ground Zero following the terror attacks of September 11th, we as a nation declared war against those who had attacked us and those associated with our attackers. Now, we made our decisions in a timely manner, which was perhaps necessary, but we also made them when we were scared and hurt and angry. And any psychologist will tell you it's best to make major decisions once emotions such as fear and pain and anger have passed. And now, more than a decade since 9/11, with no comparable attacks on American soil since, it is time for us to confront the true nature of the threat. We must urge our leaders to deal with terrorism in a way that reflects the reality of the issue as a threat to the world, but not particularly to Americans at home. We should not disregard our thinking, but we should reevaluate our priorities in such a way that we change the national discourse. It is our job to reform our thinking so that our leaders can do the same. Thank you.